right, welcome everyone to our webinar today. Today we will be talking about leading for teacher retention, 3 strategies to improve teacher satisfaction. I'm Katie Stoddard. I'm here on behalf of Daily SEL Leader. So a little bit about Daily SEL. Daily SEL Leader seeks to eliminate increasing educator turnover and attrition. We work closely with states, districts, schools, and individual educators on the use of adult SEL, transformative frameworks, and AI applications to create flourishing cultures. Our presenters today are Dr. James Bailey and Randy Weiner. They are the founders and the lead consultants at Daily SEL Leader. They are also the co-authors of the Core 1 published book, The Daily SEL Leader, which came out a couple years ago. We will put a link to that book in the chat here in just a moment. Excited to hear from James and Randy today around professional learning that really can impact those actions that leaders can take within a school to support teachers and to specifically support teacher retention. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to James and Randy. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And thanks everyone for being here. We're so humbled and honored that you choose to spend a little bit of time with us. This hour is going to fly by, and so we'd like to get right into it as we explore teacher retention and ways in which you can improve your own practice to drive that teacher retention number up. James, you want to quickly run through the agenda?
Yeah, we're having you go on kind of a hero's journey today, and we're going to do that in 3 parts. So we're going to talk, first of all, about how the dissatisfaction of teachers is happening and why it keeps growing. Our second part then is really about where do you start, and we'll give you some concrete but also theoretical ideas about what it might take to retain teachers. And then in part 3, we'll talk about what the road ahead could look like for you for retaining teachers, and we'll have a little time at the end for questions and answers.
In terms of goals, key theme for today is helping you to reflect on where you may have more control over this issue of teacher retention than you may currently think. And so we'll take a look at examining the turnover causes and costs, which you're probably familiar with the dynamic, the experience that teachers are having. We'd like to provide you with some data that can be at your fingertips to help you in conversations you may have around this. We'd like to share with you the framework we use to analyze and reduce teacher turnover. And then, as James just mentioned, we'll share a sample implementation to give you a concrete understanding of how you might actually go about doing this work. So we'll get started right here with the very first part, which is providing a little bit of context for how we all got here in the first place. James, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so we would like for you to think about these 3 questions right now. We're not going to spend a lot of time here, but as you think about the past year, the past couple of years, looking forward into next school year, how much time are you actually spending hiring? How many open spots at your school or in your district are you going to have? And how many new hires this year do you have? Let's just get a sense of where everybody are with these questions.
Feel free to post any of your thoughts in chat for others to see. Again, as James said, just to get a quick sense of how you all are individually experiencing this issue. As you're doing that, thinking about your own experience, the number of open spots you've had, the number of new hires, how much time you're spending, we want to make sure that we're centering the teacher voice throughout today's presentation. And so intermittently, we're going to come back to quotes that we've heard from speaking with teachers directly ourselves, or that other researchers have gathered out in the field, in order to make sure that we're all just really focusing on keeping that teacher perspective in mind as we think about your own leadership practice as a way to influence teacher retention. All right. So we're going to go ahead and start with the very first poll. Go ahead and take just a moment or two here to consider these options, and then select the one that most resonates for you. Again, this will give our shared community here today some visibility into where the pressures are related to teacher retention. James, there's a pretty clear leader at the moment. Oh,
Yep.
I spoke too
Others are
soon.
others are catching up here.
I'm just noticing in the chats the scale of some of these openings. They are unfortunately right in alignment with the data. The most recent from
Yeah.
Michael is saying 30 openings. And these factors in the poll are contributing to those kinds of numbers.
Yeah, it's interesting though the testing accountability, which is again dependent upon the part of the country you live in, seems to be higher sometimes. But yeah, it looks like there's a pretty even split between student behavior and salaries. Tends to be an issue.
Yeah, and we're going to have a little bit to say about that.
Yep.
All right, so we'll just take another 10 seconds or here in case you've not had a chance to respond to the poll, and then we'll close it. We'll keep on moving. All right, so as we close the poll here, low salaries, James, it looks like will maintain its lead.
Yep.
All right. Okay, so we'll have a couple other polls uh, available throughout the course of the presentation, but we'd like to pause here and take a little bit of time to talk about the bigger picture that we believe is animating some of those factors you were just thinking about that are driving teacher retention. James, would you like to start with an overview of complexity?
Yeah, so so we always sort of need to think about causes and consequences of what's going on in society in general, and the impact on schools. And the simplest but most comprehensive way that we can explain what's going on is just by the word complexity. Schools exist as part of our society, and there are sort of what we would consider sort of two big drivers. Um, the society that we work in general, right? So, we're just post COVID. There's a huge amount of anxiety around artificial intelligence. You may have local issues going on in your particular neck of the woods. The political environment across the United States is starting to gear up again. You look at the policy complexity of your own state. Again, if you start to look at budget and the role that has on salaries and school funding, a lot of the things that have come through with accountability and discipline and all that. Um, and then schools themselves are very complex endeavors, right? Because again, you have a collection of people who have different beliefs, different way of looking at things. You work in different communities. Students post COVID have different needs. We are coming off again, a 4 year. 4 years ago, COVID happened, but we're still dealing with the fallout from that. And then you start to think about people themselves, right? Your individual teachers who are having to think about um, their own families, their own finances, their own career. Is this something I want to stay in? And as we show here on the picture, our teachers are sitting right in the middle of that. Teachers and principals are sitting right in the middle of that. And the reason we have this idea of a paradigm shift is that going back 20, even 30 years ago, the policy environment with first No Child Left Behind, then Every Student Succeeds, and a lot of other things going on in states has really tried to shift the paradigm away from um, where schools used to be, to really kind of open the black box, to say that if we do, all of the things, the testing, the interventions, I mean, all of those particular things that are sort of being required of us today, that has really shifted the paradigm of our teachers, tried to shift the paradigm of our teachers. And unfortunately, I believe that it's really kind of left out the human aspect or the emotional aspect of our teachers. As a former superintendent myself, I know I was highly driven by that because that's what was being preached to us from our state departments, our legislators, is that we're spending all this money, and look at what's happening with student achievement. And our competitiveness as a world, which I think, to be honest, looking back now, was probably a wrong direction in a lot of ways. But long story short, this idea of complexity falls in on schools on a daily basis, as you know, and it's really tried to shift a way of thinking about schools. But unfortunately, the organizational structure has not changed to adapt very well to those complexities.
Yeah, just to underscore something James just said at the end, oftentimes when we share this diagram with leaders like yourselves, what we find is not that we're breaking any news to you, but that we are giving you some vocabulary that you can use, or a way of thinking about your daily experience, your teacher's daily experience, in perhaps a new way. And that sometimes simply having the vocabulary and labeling these dynamics as complexity can be a form of relief. And so we're offering up this perspective in hopes that you do gain some relief from thinking about your world in this way. And in terms of your world, the complexity solar system that we've designed here isn't necessarily meant to be authoritative. There might be many more planets, there probably are. There may be different moons in your particular universe. Our point is not to say this is your complexity so much as to illustrate you could map your complexity similarly. And in doing so, you may find that you put yourself and your community in positions to surface opportunities that you might not otherwise have seen without presenting the problem or thinking about the problem in this particular way.
Yeah, so given the nature of complexity, if that's the cause, here's the consequence, right? Um, if we look at the idea of stress as this big technical term, biopsychosocial phenomena, and basically all that means in short is that the social world in which teachers exist, right? The schools, their communities, their homes, that impacts the way that people think about things. It impacts their psychology, which ultimately impacts their biology, right? So if you think about stress is not something that just happens, but it sort of goes through these layers from the social world in through our mental worlds, which impacts our biology, our hearts, our lungs, our skin, the whole kit and caboodle, so to speak. What a lot of data says is that teachers, as a serving profession, is very stressful, right? So again, if you look at some of the latest polls out there from AFT and from other people, the latest poll, 61% of teachers said work was often stressful. A Merrimack poll said that 42% of teachers surveyed said that their mental health and well-being was impacted by the stress of the day. And from an economic standpoint, stress across the US in all professions is $180 billion deficit that goes on because of those health related illnesses, right? So it's not just that it's bad news at the school, but this does have an impact on individuals and financial insurance costs and things like that across schools and districts in the United States.
Yeah, these data points are useful not just at school board meetings, for example, but also in social settings. The next time someone tells you that teaching or education is not a difficult profession because there's supposedly a few months off over the course of the summer. This is about quantity in this case, and the impact of the work, the emotional labor that your teachers and you are engaged in every single day. And there's ways to think about the costs of that stress, right? And this is also not exhaustive. These are just some ways of thinking about the dimensions of this problem. And so in your particular world, you might think about multiplying, just on the back of the envelope, the number of teachers you've had to replace by the average of $9,000 to $17,000 per teacher replacement cost. That starts to add up very, very quickly when we're talking about constrained school budgets. The amount of time that you have to sink into training those new teachers who've come into your community. Again, as you well know, we can think about this in financial figures as well, $20,000 to $25,000 in terms of the training there. So the impact, the costs to teacher retention are enormous. And again, in your own world, thinking about the numbers in these ways, you should be able to quickly hold these up next to other challenges or threats or opportunities to your community to determine where exactly teacher retention sits. And we would argue you're likely to find this one easily in the top three, if not at the very, very top. James, what would you add?
Yeah, I would just point out on the right side, those are aggregated costs across the United States. And if you just look at that middle number, that's the one that astounded me when I ran it, and that's a pre-COVID number too. If you look at that, 760,000 teachers turnover every single year. 760,000 teachers, right? And that costs $8 billion to replace them, right? So if if the problem is not big enough from a financial impact, then again, I don't know what is. But again, the amount of time and effort that we put into doing this, we're looking again at this as a downstream problem. In a little bit, we're going to talk about ways that we possibly can prevent some of that.
Keep it going, James.
Yeah. So basically, again, and this research is from 2016, but I think it still holds out pretty well for today. And that is, if we change the attrition, in other words, the turnover, which back then was about 8% of the yearly turnover was because of attrition. Attrition meaning people just leaving the workforce, going to another place, not leaving the field entirely. But that is the leaky bucket, right? And if we can solidify and close the leaky bucket, that would change the attrition and the shortage more than any single factor. This was research done in 2016, and for my estimations and research, it still holds true to this day.
So in the last 15 minutes, we've spent some time trying to lay out the problem, the size of the problem, talking a little bit about why this problem of teacher retention or the challenge of retaining more teachers may exist. Before we start moving into some of the strategies, we wanted to offer you an opportunity to just reflect for a moment on a couple of ways in which you might be able to start thinking about taking greater control. And we're going to go into more detail on that in just a moment. But again, if you're comfortable, share your thoughts on either or both of these questions in chat for the benefit of your colleagues. So we're wondering about how your life would change if you increased teacher retention in your community. And then what's preventing you from taking more control of addressing and making an impact on this issue today? Go ahead, and if you're comfortable, share your thoughts in chat. Less stress, James, better student outcomes, which is ultimately what this is entirely about.
Yep, saving time. Yep, that's that's one of the key factors, definitely.
That's right. Saving time, being able to reallocate the time that you have in different ways.
Yep, safety at schools, more consistency. Yep.
So the community here is echoing what we can all find in the research as the expectations for what will happen on the other side of addressing this problem, which really starts to lead to the question, James, of how do we do it and why aren't we doing more of it? And so we should try to answer those questions.
Let's take a shot at it, right?
Yeah. All right. So here in the second part, we're going to do just that. We're going to start talking about concrete strategies to help you understand where you can start. Go ahead, James.
Yeah. So earlier we said we're sort of going on this hero's journey, and we're saying that as leaders of schools, as teachers in schools, you are the heroes of this, right? And part of the idea about starting is that we often try to look externally for the answers, right? So you go back to our original poll, a lot of people talked about salaries as a primary issue. Great, I agree, necessary, but I'm going to tell you it's not sufficient by itself, right? So the responsibility, um, we have to consider this part of the story as we are 100% responsible for it, right? So if nobody's coming to your rescue, and it looks like nobody is at this point, then people in the schools themselves are going to have to rethink the way schools are thought about, the way schools are designed, and certainly policy and legislators need to pony up more money. I totally agree. But the question I always ask is, okay, we pay teachers $100,000 every year. Does anything change in schools? People may be a little happier. They may not have to worry as much about the financial aspect, but that in and of itself will not change what goes on day to day in schools. So what we have to start doing again is looking internally first before we start relying on the external world to make things happen.
Yeah, and this is far easier said than done. And when we talk with leaders and we ask them for thoughts on who's responsible, we ask them some of those reflection questions that we just asked you. The responses we often get are, "Of course we care. Of course you care," and it's unclear what we can do concretely to try to make an impact. And we're even seeing some of that, James, in the chat, folks talking about, I just don't know where to start. And James and I believe very firmly that a great place to start is with yourself. When James is talking about looking internally, that's what he's referring to. And that fits in with this theme of where you likely have more rather than less control. And we posit that when you start to think about this challenge in terms of where you have more rather than less control, there are some new opportunities that arise. Go ahead, James.
So where this really takes us, this is probably my favorite quote when I start to talk about the teacher retention issues, right? And basically that is we can stay where we are, right? And we can continue to spend lots of time and money, $8 billion a year, on recruiting new teachers into our positions, or we can really again take a new mental model, a new way to look at this problem. And again, as the quote says, venture forth to discover new places of possibility, right? Because the old ways that schools are creating these turnovers, the way society is creating these turnovers, we need to change that. We have to think about it in a much different perspective so that we can actually do something about this problem.
So here's, again, a quick, you can do this on the back of an envelope, on a napkin, scratch paper. Here's another quick tool that you can use to help identify where you believe you have more rather than less control. And so in these quadrants, what you're looking at is influences on teacher well-being, either external or internal influences, and then measuring those, comparing those against where you may have less control or more control. Just like in the complexity diagram, this is just an example James and I have put together. You may disagree with where we've placed certain elements here. That's fine. We're not trying to convince you that this is the way that your map should look, so much as we're saying, taking just a moment, because this can be done in less than 5 minutes, to sketch out where you see having more control and less control, and then thinking about whether or not you're investing in those places where you have more control, particularly on internal influences on teacher well-being, things you yourself are responsible for, may help to lead you in a slightly different or perhaps very different direction. James, what would you add?
Yeah, so I think what you said, the key word there, investment. And investment is not only time, but it's your personal energy. We can spend an awful lot of time up in the upper left corner, worrying about state policy, worrying about are they going to give new money. You can't control it, right? You can lobby, you can do all you can for that, but ultimately that's out of your control. Things down in the lower right corner, though, are things, again, as a school, as a leader, that you can actually invest lots of time and money in. And we're going to get to those here in just a minute.
Yeah, and that just to note, those lower right are not necessarily easier to influence than other factors you might map elsewhere, but they are places where you ought to have more control. All right, keep it going, James.
So ultimately, what we want to talk about here is the ultimate outcome of an effective school on teachers is a well-being issue, right? It's about well-being, which includes health, mental health, physical health, emotional health. And again, the research is really, really clear on this, that the less well-being we have in school, the more stress, the more burnout, the emotional exhaustion, which negatively impacts students. If I don't have the emotional energy to support myself, I'm not going to be able to support students, especially those from disenfranchised communities, right? On the other hand, we actually know that greater well-being in school leads to a greater commitment and satisfaction, right? It's a reciprocal agreement. If I feel good in a school, I'm going to be more satisfied. I'm going to be more committed. I'm going to stay to that, right? So well-being is the term that we're going to use. And again, that is very encompassing of a lot of different areas, but that's the ultimate outcome we believe should be, the mark of a good school.
Yeah, as uh, former school leaders ourselves, we're constantly thinking about the world in which you all live. And anytime we can find a decision that's a no regrets decision, feels like a win. There's real clarity here. This is a no regrets investment for you to make. There is no bad outcome in trying to move this needle. And so the strategies that we're going to discuss to do just that include the notion of reducing demands on your teachers, creating resources for your teachers, and the development of your own first and eventually their own SEL skills.
So the model we use, and again, this is why we did that initial poll about, what would cause people to leave or stay. And if you again look to an internal view of the world, right, the internal view of a school, which many of you had alluded to in the chat, that when a school community is healthy, people are more prone to stay. And we use a tool or a framework called the jobs, demands, and resources model, and it is basically an energy and well-being. That again, when people have physical, emotional, social energy that they can actually apply to that, um, we 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 have better outcomes in schools. We have better satisfaction, and so the big key here to keep in mind again is that this is an energy related idea, and that your demands have to be less than the resources in order to have a very successful and energized school.
This model is common, James, in other industries. We just don't find it in schools very often. But going below the surface, I'm certain everyone in the audience understands this implicitly in their gut, right? And so again, this is another way where just having some new vocabulary or a new way to think about your current experience can sometimes yield outsized results. And it's well grounded inside of the research. This very simple quote, in many ways, gets to the heart of what we're talking about by holding up the idea that within your school community, you and your other stakeholders can choose to actively, to intentionally design your employees' experience. If we were all to go work in hotel management, for example, we would live by this. When we walk into a hotel lobby, there is a very explicit experience, for example, that hotel is trying to communicate. We can choose to do something similar for our teachers. No matter what our constraints are, there's always room to try to improve upon the employee experience, the teacher experience. And that's what this particular quote is really trying to elevate. James, other thoughts there?
Nope, we better move on here.
All right, let's keep going. Okay, go ahead.
All right. So again, in this model, the first strategy that we're going to talk about is the idea about reducing demands, right? And all a demand is, it's an energy drainer, right? It's anything physical, psychological, social, organizational. It's something that depletes your energy. Um, and so here again are some specific quotes that come from teachers, and we won't read these to you, but you'll get a sense of how teachers are talking about this idea of demands.
And you yourself certainly experience this at least from time to time, right? This is not just something that teachers experience. We know you do too. We just want to keep holding up the reality of the teacher experience so we don't lose it or look past it if we sometimes find ourselves questioning whether or not teachers are properly reporting or experiencing or justified in sharing their experience with us.
So
Go ahead.
on a conceptual model, here's kind of what it looks like. We'll walk you through this, so don't get concerned about all the arrows and lines and everything. But working from left to right. Again, our experience and our research shows that there are three types of demands, and we have them labeled in red as a sort of a negative. There are personal demands, and those personal demands again come from your own health, your own family. If you're a young father or mother trying to take care of children and work, you know how difficult that can be. Classroom demands, right? It depends upon the behavior of the student. That was something that we saw in the poll also, right? But classroom demands are new technologies, new curriculum, having the right amount of resources to do those things, right? And workplace demands are those things. I saw something in the chat earlier about safety of school. That's a demand on one's energy, right? But it can be also negative colleagues. It can be working in a state where a lot of negative press goes to teachers or a community. And all of those, in a sense, aggregate into this big pool that we just label again as job demands, right? And this is a multiplicative, it's not an additive, but it is a multiplicative, right? So if I've had a bad, if my child didn't sleep last night, I'm going to be more prone to look for bad behaviors in the classroom, let that get to me. And then my feeling like my principal doesn't support me, that's going to multiply that. And this leads again to this job demands that leads to this idea called health improve or health impairment process, right? So again, we all of us can sustain a bad day, right? We all have bad days where stress sort of accumulates, which sort of impacts our well-being for that particular day. The problem, however, in the job demands model is that when those are sustained bad days, right? When every day is similar, that creates stress after stress after stress, really impacts teacher well-being. School leadership, as you see, sort of sits here in the middle, right? And school leadership can be a negative. We'll show it can be a positive also. But if school leadership is not helping to reduce those demands, or if it's not helping the individual or team work through some issues, it can also lead to excess stress, excess burnout, and things like that.
Yeah, so let's engage in another poll related to demands, right? And so think now about which demand category, the personal, this might be outside of school life, the classroom, behavior as student behavior as an example of a classroom demand, workplace demands, challenging manager with whom to work, or something other. What's most intense in your organization? And so, James, as we're seeing this come in, right, I think a knee jerk response would be if you're a leader inside of a school who identifies classroom demands as the most pressing, then we'd want to go back and think about, well, what sort of control do I have over impacting those classroom demands? Even if I might be facing demands or my staff may be facing demands elsewhere, if classroom demands are number one, then I may do well to invest the most in reducing those demands.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's pretty telling. I mean, this is almost identical to what you see in national data around this. But again, the classroom seems to be the place where the most demands are placed and where the most stress happens. Which, again, that's why teaching is a highly stressful profession. But without the right supports, that's why we get that health impairment process on an ongoing basis from people.
Yeah, and that prioritization mindset is important here. We're not saying ignore the other demands. We're just saying that given the limited resources you may have and your own personal limited energy, you may do well to focus in one area, despite the fact that you may very well work in an environment that is doing everything it can to dilute that focus.
All right, so the other part of the model is the resources, right? And the resources are the good things. They're the supports, and they are a parallel to the demands, right? So they are the physical, psychological, social, organizational things that help you achieve your goals, that reduce the demands, or that help you grow as an individual. Um, so again, here are the quotes. This is a little bit sort of the counter of a good resource. But what you can see again is the notion of the lack of energy, the lack of thing because of the lack of resources, the lack of support for people that causes these things.
So if we can increase resources, we may be able to bring down the frequency with which teachers report back those types of experiences.
Right. So here's what this looks like again, right? So again, the resources parallel the demands. So there are personal resources. If you have a very supportive family, if you have internal resilience, if you have good internal social emotional skills yourself, that is a resource that you can draw upon, right? A classroom resource, right? Those are things. Do you have good relationships with students? Do you have the resources physical? Do you have the right computers? Do you have the right curricular materials? If you're undergoing change, do you have the right supports? Do you have instructional coaches or technology coaches to actually help you through that? Workplace resources, again, those are supportive colleagues, right? Do you have people? Do you have a best friend at work? Do you have a good team that you can bring problems to, whether it's behavior or curricular or instructional, that you can actually get support around, right? And again, all of those aggregate into the bucket of resources, right? And so the two-way arrow between resources and demands, the greater the resources, that will pull down those demands, right? So it doesn't feel, even though the job may be demanding, it's going to help mitigate those or pull those away from you. And the more days of those resources that add up over time, you get what's known as the motivational process, which impacts the teacher well being. And again, the school leadership sits at the nexus of this, right? So the school leadership is the key resource, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But school leadership is a critical resource to help reduce those demands. So again, here it's shown as green. So it is one thing that can switch on and off very easily to help add to those resources.
And this scales. And so, even if you have relatively few resources, you can still think about how to balance the available resources against the demands so that you get as close to at least break even as you possibly can. James was just mentioning that principles are essential here. Here's a stat that you can bring into your next meeting when you're seeking a raise. This is for real. Principals are essential to preventing teacher turnover, not ancillary, essential, which is going to take us into talking about the importance of developing leaders' own SEL skills, something that is too often overlooked as a critical part of this overall framework for trying to reduce teacher attrition. Go ahead, James.
Yeah. So again, here's a quote: "Adults looking for SEL, just like students are looking for that." So, um, as we continue down looking at these ideas of support, right? Again, here is this study comes out of South Carolina, and basically what they did is they asked teachers and they asked students, what would it take for you to actually move into education? And these are the things that actually came out as the forms of support that teachers are really looking for, right? And as you look at those and look at that list, all of these things have an inkling of social emotional learning to them, right? They want good relationships with their leaders. They want the respect. They want some say on change. All of those things really matter to our teaching force.
Yeah. And so if you were to choose, for example, to invest more deeply in building trust, you could do worse, right? This is not saying you need to go after all of these attributes all at once, but it does indicate a really solid example of things that you have control over that will contribute to the likelihood of supporting teachers and decreasing their decision to leave.
Again, as part of the JDR model, again, as we talked about, the idea that school leadership sits in the middle of this. And this particular set of blue arrows, right? This is from another researcher named Kenneth Leithwood, who talks about 4 paths of influence that leaders have with teachers, and this one, called the emotional path, has the most underdeveloped and underutilized set of practices in schools. I was never trained on this as a leader. I wish I would have been. But what you begin to look at is, starting in the middle, is that the whole SCL thing, leaders have to understand how to take care of themselves. So these are what we call the basic skills. When you go to the right side, that arrow, which is a two-way arrow, the intermediate skills, this is how leaders and teachers can work individually and in small teams. So how do they actually work together? So again, when I do have a stressful day, how does that leader actually help that teacher sort of recover from that, or that team recover from it? On the left side then are what we would call advanced skills, right? This is the collective. This is the school in its entirety, and these are setting what people would commonly refer to as the culture. We call them the common. Leithwood calls them the common affective states. So things like trust, like feeling efficacious, like satisfaction, right? And notice how that sort of intervenes in that job demands and resources interaction. That again, if an organization and a leadership team has created a trustful organization, then the demands and resources tend to balance themselves out much easier.
Yeah. And so concrete examples of these different levels that James just mentioned, basic, intermediate, advanced, include, and this is again not exhausted by any stretch, but you yourself can choose to engage in a gratitude practice if you are not already doing so. In under 5 minutes every single day, expressing gratitude for anything, it could be your cup of coffee, is proven over and over again in the research to contribute to overall better well being. At the intermediate level, where it's now not just about you, but you and another person or a small group, there are techniques and concepts such as positive communication. That's an actual strategy that is well defined. You could choose to learn about that, adopt it, and start practicing it. And then at the advanced level, where you're dealing with a much larger stakeholder group, the notion of, for example, establishing a community routine of reappraising events, ensuring that biases, implicit biases, are not disproportionately or unfairly coloring the way in which your community is processing information or making decisions, is a concrete example of how these skills can work. And so we like to work with folks moving from the basic to the intermediate to the advanced. And you'll notice that all of this plays into, as James mentioned, better supporting your ability to reduce demands, better supporting your ability to create resources, and overall creating an environment in which teachers are more likely to flourish rather than experience the current state.
All
All
right.
right. Go ahead, James.
So we've been through two parts. We laid out the problem. We've laid out potential solutions. So what does the road ahead look like for us? All right, so here's an implementation example, right? We've worked on different pieces with different schools, but again, what you'll see here is a couple different themes. One is, again, you see the strategies, how we would, advise, removing demands, adding resources, developing the adult SEL. But what you can actually see are those things that schools actually have a lot of control over, right? So you'll see by removing demands, you can see the removal of practices that aren't really impacting achievement, but just something we think we should do. It is trying to attend and give more time back to individuals so they actually have time to do the instructional work, the instructional planning. And it's also attempting to give them their lives back, right? So the no meals or no emails after 5:30, that should be a policy across the board where your family life is not eaten into. You'll see in the adding resources again how the time consideration and prioritizing time, but also something as simple as cleaning process, right? If our schools are clean, we feel better about the places we work. So how do we actually do that? And then as you see a 3-year plan to actually work on adult SEL, starting with the leaders themselves, um, continuing that. But all of this, in a sense, is driven by a lot of data. So data for a particular different reason. And what you'll see on this next slide is what sort of a 4-phase retention strategy would look like, right? So we would work with you, first of all, on doing, again, the costs of this. So what is it costing you yearly for teacher turnover? We would next start to work with you around removing demands. So how do we actually use what we have is called a JDR diagnostic? We do these flash surveys, which are one question to look at the stress in the building. We look at the SEL. We use professional development to help you understand demands. And then we coach teams between time to actually work on removing those. Then we go to the increasing resources, which again uses data, SEL, professional development. And then sort of an offshoot of that is we can actually work with you on, applying artificial intelligence as a time saver to help you be more efficient at your particular job. Randy, what did I leave out?
No, I think that's a great place for us to pause and take some questions. As you said, we've walked through some of the dimensions of the problem of teacher attrition, the challenges related to retaining teachers. We've offered 3 concrete ways in which leaders can start immediately to, at a minimum, think about how to change an approach or build upon an approach to these problems, reducing demands, creating resources, developing adult SEL. And now we've just shared briefly, as we can in an hour session, ways in which we might actually go about doing that work. Katie, if there are questions from the community, we'd love to do our best to respond.
Yes, we have one from Heather, and she asks, can you speak to the meaning of agent over change? How should that be defined to teachers?
Agency over change, I think, was one of the supports that we showed. James, you want to speak to that? Would you like me to take it?
Yeah, I would just say that agency over change basically is, do they have a say so, right? Are they being told what to do, or are they being involved as professionals in decisions that affect their classroom? I think that's as simple as I would make it.
And then James or Randy, also, can we see that strategy slide again? Was another request.
Yep. Do we think this is what folks are referring to?
Yep, that's it.
That's the one. Yeah. Yeah, here when James was talking about this, James highlighted, for example, the no emails after 5:30 p.m. And this is a fun one to pick on, because what we find, again, in working with leaders is, in the midst of an emotional up and down day, week, month, year, it can be very hard to take a moment to breathe, pull back, and consider options that are actually on the table. And so while we all live in a world where emails are constantly going back and forth, We do actually have some choice over this, and it doesn't necessarily have to be this way. And you also don't need to look at something like this as a stone tablet that you need to carve. You might try just one day or a few days out of a week just to see how folks experience life in a less demanding environment.
Yeah, it's giving people spaciousness, right? Because part of the complexity is the speed of information, right? It used to be when I started as a principal a long time ago, you'd actually have to walk to a teacher's room to ask her a question, right? Now you can just do it on an email. I can do that across my entire building like that. And but the expectation is that you respond very quickly. And that adds to that level of stress.
Right. Um, the only other questions, let me ask just one more question and then we can end things today. So, how do you deal with the reality of external demands from the district or the state or other entities that you can't refuse?
We were talking about this just earlier today. James, what were we discussing then?
Yeah, I mean the thing is there's a continuum, right? There is do what you're told because you have to, right? On the other end is ignore it and take your lumps, take your consequences. We sit in the middle on most continuums, and that is try to think about the best way to do that from research, right? So we were talking about like test preparation, right? So if you get an order from your superintendent, you got to do 2 weeks of test prep. Okay, does that mean 2 weeks prior to the test? Or can you actually look at the research of space practice, retrieval practice, and do that through the course of a year and using good formative assessment as a way to actually do that better and more intentionally rather than try to cram everything in? So again, what I would say is, yeah, there are certain things you're going to have to do, but think about being very intentional and scientific from the research on the best ways to do those things.
Yeah,
Can you talk about how your book specifically fits into this strategy approach?
sure. And thanks for the question. So the book, The Daily SEL Leader, uh, was written specifically for school leaders. We conducted quite a bit of research, and we were told over and over again by school leaders that we care deeply about our own SEL and developing it. But if you ask us to spend more than 5 minutes or read more than 400 words per day, we simply won't do it. And so we took that as a creative challenge. And the book is largely a journal that allows leaders to jump in on any skill at any time that is important to them. And every single day's exercise is meant to be 5 minutes or less. There is a quote to drive some inspiration. There is a reflection prompt similar to some of the reflections we've offered today. There is a call to gratitude. And then there's a whole lot of space to capture one's own thoughts related to that particular topic, because James and I are very aware that whatever our own personal leadership SEL journey is probably not yours. And we want to be very respectful of that and provide some guidance that fits into your busy day so that time can't be an excuse, a reasonable one, but can't be an excuse any longer for not developing a consistent, ongoing routine to develop your own skills, given the knock on effect that comes with that improvement.
So on the one chart where we talked about the emotional path, basically the book sits right in the middle of those foundational skills. So everything Randy just talked about was building the foundational skills of leaders so they can take care of themselves and understand their own social emotional needs so they can lead better.
All right. So we just wanted to share one, thank you all for those questions. Thank you all for being here and spending your very precious time with us. We do not take that for granted. We wanted to let you know that we have a national leadership cohort coming up that's going to launch on June 4th. It's 16 weeks where every week, every other week, we meet together for an hour to go deeper into leadership SEL. And so if you've enjoyed today's session in this national cohort, we provide even more insights and concrete strategies that you can use in order to not only improve your own leadership practice, but improve it in a way that contributes to addressing the teacher retention problem and many other challenges that you may be facing as well.
Yep.
And I think
Thank you,
with
everybody.
that, we are done for today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for joining. Again, I'll leave the slide up here for a quick moment. We shared a link to the free download in the chat as well. Here you can follow Daily SEL as well as James and Randy. You can email them directly here. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, James and Randy, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Hi, everyone.